Morning, Pete.
Good morning, Adrian. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Just thought we'd burn a bit of dollar this morning. As soon as we this should be the Christmas episode. So I was gonna have a fireplace in the background with some stockings hanging on it, but I thought no, let's keep this real. And if you're not keeping up with your cyber security, then basically that's what you're doing.
I love it. Okay, I'm not going to set fire to any of my guitars. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Well, today we're talking about privileged escalation. I mean, probably to a layman, it probably sounds like some sort of higher plane of existence, or certainly travelling to. But I think in today's terms, we'll try and keep it to layman's terms and explain what privileged escalation is all about.
Mm, okay. Well, as an overview, I guess the important factor is that someone, whether they're an authenticated user or an intruder, is able to get access to stuff, whatever that stuff is, that they shouldn't. Usually because that information or those controls or whatever should be restricted to a small group, say of administrators or managers or some other privileged group. And privilege escalation, by definition, is someone who doesn't have that privilege, who's able to get themselves that privilege without going through the proper channels.
Yeah, so I suppose another way to simply put that is one of the main threats for getting hacked as such is privileged escalation. So it is about being given at times too much security access, or on a out of the box configuration, people having full administrative access on their laptop, on their device, on their Linux box, let's say, and the threat actors being able to infiltrate and use their security privilege to get to more stuff, as you say.
Yeah, it can be. But I think the majority of privilege escalation activities fall into two categories. One is an intruder, someone who gets a normal user's credentials and is able to leverage those in some way, usually through some form of misconfiguration or poor password or some mistake that the target organization has made, so that that individual who has, let's say, just a standard user's privilege can find a way to grant themselves administrative privilege. And the other category is when a member of staff, either intentionally or accidentally, but most commonly intentionally, grants themselves higher levels of privilege through some other form of exploitation. And that's really a category, part of what we call the insider threat.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly we've seen that a lot, and sometimes it's not necessarily malicious. People try and do that or have done that for the want of ease of access, for the want of saving time, for instance. That's some of the no point in putting it any differently, excuses that I've heard around that sort of privileged escalation. It's not good. It's not cool to do that, because it leaves you wide open to attack. And if those people are having to work around systems in that sense, then generally they haven't been trained the right ways in administrating the domain, the network, those accounts. And so again, the training element always must come first.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a short story from my deep history. It's a story about what was then the Inland Revenue, is now HMRC, where allegedly employees were not allowed to change their desktop background on their Windows machines. And that became a challenge for the workforce. And a lot of effort was put in researching, searching the web, finding ways that they could overcome that control. And the only way to do it realistically at the time was to find a way to give yourself local administrative authority on that Windows machine. And then, of course, you could make any changes you like. So the objective was, you might say, trivial or relatively innocent, but the net effect was catastrophic. And sometimes I think organizations don't put enough thought into why they have the controls they have in place and what the consequences might be if a determined individual wants to overcome those controls for a relatively benign or innocent reason.
Yeah, or even communicating why they've made those configurations the way they are.
Yeah, so why isn't popular, is it?
No, it's not popular, but it's certainly necessary. And again, putting things into non-technical terms is key to that.
Yeah. Back in the day when pretty much everything was on premise, we hundreds and hundreds of times were engaged to test local area networks from a number of different perspectives. So we'd be on site and we'd be asked to see whether that network was adequately secure. And as I've mentioned in other discussions many times, typically as a guest, someone who hasn't been given any sort of Windows account, for example, didn't take us too long to not only get access to the network, but also to have full administrative control of that network. The time it takes varies dramatically, but I think the shortest time ever was about 20 minutes. And I think the longest time ever was about a day and a bit. And, in both cases, it's really quite worrying, because as a domain administrator in a Windows environment, you can pretty much do as you please with just about everything. Data, accounts, machines, pretty much anything you like. And there are probably a good, I would guess, 10 or a dozen techniques to achieve that don't involve any special tools, don't involve any really clever hacking techniques as such. It's just thinking outside the box as usual. And I think a lot of businesses and organizations have thought that if they're now migrating to, say, cloud-based systems and they're using Microsoft 365, that maybe all those configuration issues that were such a challenge in the past have been left in the past. But actually, that's not the case. Unfortunately, we replicate exactly the same challenges in the cloud environment. And if the configuration isn't spot on and audited by someone with the right security knowledge about a Microsoft environment, then those same vulnerabilities still exist.
So yeah, it's we put a lot of emphasis on the user perhaps trying to get around or being at fault on this one, but that's not always the case either, is it?
No, absolutely, not at fault. Well, I mean, I was a CEO of a company for a lot of years, and if there was something wrong with the company, guess whose fault it was? It was mine. I'm the CEO. And in these terms, I think there are probably two mistakes. One is, you alluded to earlier, which is not explaining to people why controls are in place, why they have access to something and not something else, just treating them as adults, because it's difficult and time consuming. And the other is not understanding that any product you buy, I mean, we always talk about Windows because it's a de facto platform that everybody works from, but nevertheless, any platform, any application, the defaults will not be appropriately secure for the organization, because each organization is different. And frankly, the products are made to be easy to use, and that means they're not necessarily secure in all the right ways. And there's plenty of guides out there, aren't there, on how to improve or set up the right security. But it still seems to be the case that very few organizations actually study that or go through that process.
Or continue with that as well, because there have been many cases where I know you as well have gone into organizations where updates are not regularly kept up to date.
Sure, of course. Yeah. It's the old M&M thing, isn't it? Most organizations, if you look at them, are relatively hard and crispy on the outside and soft and soggy inside. And I think the perception that inside is safe whether it's about wearing badges when you're in the office, or whether it's about securing and patching devices that are inside the organization or inside the organization's cloud, that perception is wildly wrong, especially with so much connectivity today, all the supply chain connections, the API connections, remote working, so many ways in, so that although you may not be physically present inside the building, you are virtually present with all the same opportunities.
Of course, and then it's not testing other devices that may be connected to either the localized computer or its network as well, and especially with the advent of IoT, information of thing type devices, and everyday people just installing them on networks where there isn't the security to necessarily stop them from doing so, is also a factor.
Yeah, of course it is. And I always, of course, security is an onion, and you've got to have all the right layers in place. In the same way, it's an onion from a vulnerability point of view. And, you may get through one control and find other controls in your way. Then you think past those and find another layer of controls. But sometimes there's a shortcut just to bypass all those layers of control. And that's what people don't understand, because they think like the defender, not like the attacker. And yeah, the IoT provides an opportunity to gain access to a network. So does a poorly configured router, if we're talking about remote worker. So might a poorly considered firewall. But if we're talking about a criminal or criminal group who are interested in getting at some critical information that an organization owns, they're going to always take the path that's easiest and the path that is of least risk. I mean, that's just human nature. And if they want to carry on being criminals, they don't want to get caught. And if they want to be successful criminals, they want to make sure they've covered all the bases, so they've got the easiest way in. And the easiest, there's that old adage, hackers don't break in, they log in. And that's why privilege escalation is so important, because if they can log in even with an unprivileged account, then all the other opportunities arise to escalate that, to give them administrative privilege. So you don't need to be physically present in the office these days. You can be remote anywhere. But in the end, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, the softest entry point is the first port of call for a criminal. So they may well use an IoT device to gain access, and we shouldn't ignore that, but they're much more likely to log in as a legitimate user, having somehow gained those credentials fairly simply through social engineering techniques. And once they're logged in as that standard user, if you will, then the world's their oyster. It's a standard approach. It's the approach that was used in that attack against RSA all those years ago, which they documented so beautifully, and which formed the basis for red team testing, basically, where you do your research, you find your vulnerable user or users, you use social engineering to get their credentials. And once you have their credentials, then you're off exploring the network. I think, going back to Windows again for a moment, most importantly, a lot of the assumptions about whether a Windows domain is secure or not, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, are based on the assumption that the attacker is logged in through a legitimate member of the domain computer. But if you're not, if you have access to that network, but you decline to use the front door of logging in as a Windows domain user, but rather you go below that and start scanning around using command line tools to find the other devices, you can attempt to log on directly to a server or another workstation. And very soon, especially in a large organization, you will inevitably find a misconfigured device. And often that's, say, a local administrator account which hasn't had its password set or changed. Or it might be a router or a switch inside the organization that isn't patched up to date, or is running a weak form of SNMP. Sorry, I'm getting a bit technical here. But there are many, many different ways once you're on the network. So the primary skin of that onion, the most important defense, in my opinion, is the user account, the need to use two-factor authentication, the requirement to educate users not to share their credentials, and why. That would prevent a significant proportion of these sorts of attacks.
Yeah, I think the wired and wireless vulnerability thing is probably a good one for another episode. But yeah, certainly sticking on topic with the privileged escalation. What it then is, and we've discussed a few ways of doing this, but what are the best ways of helping secure us against that sort of privileged escalation attack vulnerability, however you want to phrase it?
I would suggest number one is a good network discovery exercise so that you know every device that's on your network. Typically, people don't. They think they do, but they don't. And there are lots of different styles of entry point. So you don't just think about the computers, the workstations and laptops and servers. You also think about the infrastructure on that network as well. So if you've got a good catalogue of all the devices, then you can find the right standards for securing each of those devices online very readily. And then you ask your technical team to audit a sample of each of those devices to make sure that those basic checks have been done. And a lot of infrastructure devices, for example, will come with a default username and password. And part of the setup process will be to create a new account with administrative privilege that has a unique name and a difficult password. But sometimes, more often than you'd suspect, in fact, they don't remove the original default account. Yep. And it's never used. And what else? Most commonly, things like utilities that run on servers, say a backup or antivirus or some other automated process. Because of the way Windows work, it must also have an account and a password. And contrary to popular belief, it's possible to log in as if you were a service rather than a user, and you can use the privilege of that utility account. So those two need to be checked and make sure that the passwords are hard to guess. I mean, a number of times we found the account called backup with a password of backup. It's, and many other examples, but using a password similar or the same as the account name for a utility is not unknown. Plus there's the handbook or the manuals that come with the software package and gives examples. A lot of people just use the example. So, and of course, default passwords for pretty much every infrastructure device are published on the web. That's to help people who lock themselves out of something, but they're also a marvelous resource for criminals. So I think identifying all of the components on your network, no matter how big a challenge that is, and making sure at least a sample of each type have been hardened using the correct guidance. You'll find they haven't, and there's the start of the project.
Yeah, and I suppose, and that's where some people have the misconception that penetration testing is the be-all and end-all of cybersecurity. And certainly, as we can attest to, that's not the case. Again, that sort of auditing of not only what we've talked about here today, but of Google Cloud environments, Microsoft Cloud environments, any sort of cloud environment also counts for that sort of level of configuration or misconfiguration, as the case may be, to make sure that not only are they solidified. I say that again, it's that sort of M&M analogy again, solidified on the outside, so they are at least one layer of that security method. Again, with the two-factor authentication around a lot of these devices is absolutely key to that. But also looking at the more technical measures around things like securing switches and routers and all those sort of network bits of equipment. And those methods, those protocols have been around for a long time. And we're also then gonna at some point hear about your wireless access points and how the vulnerabilities in those sort of things can work, which also looks at the sort of wireless things within routers as well. So again, other bits and pieces that need to be analysed.
Yeah, yeah. I think, summary-wise, I think the best approach really is to try and emulate the criminal mind, as always, and that will give you a good reflection of a non-criminal individual as well, because everybody takes the easiest route if they can, and that means thinking through the stack for your business. Where are the most likely attack vectors, as always? Where's the front door, and where's the side door, where's the back door? So to understand what's in your IT environment comprehensively, to understand, of course, where the key information is. But once you've escalated privilege, it doesn't really matter where you put it, because they will find it eventually if they have administrative privilege. So in this discussion, we need to understand all the devices, what's best practice to secure them without making them unusable, and how do we constantly monitor for change? Who's responsible for regularly redoing that network discovery exercise, finding the new devices and making sure they too are hardened to the correct standard? And oh, and of course, it'd be a great idea if we actually had some procedures written on how to do it and references to the correct documents to use. That would be even better. And to try and encourage the IT people who don't like, who does like using checklists, they don't, because I know how to do my job, don't give me a checklist. But, to make sure that they are audited regularly and to make sure they are educated as to, they think they know it all, but actually they don't from the criminal's point of view. You might be an expert on Cisco devices. You might be an expert on Windows domains, but that doesn't mean that you can think. In fact, it's more likely you won't think like the attacker, because you know the right way to do things.
So are we advocating methods like zero tolerance in terms of configuration and privilege?
I think not. I think what needs to be done is start at the bottom and configure the devices correctly first. Now, there's lots of alternatives. In the old days, if you had a set of routers and switches in an organization, you would have to log on to each of them in turn. And that would require shared passwords amongst the communication of the comms people, comms team. These days, of course, you can have central authentication for those devices. That needs to be air-gapped from the way that you authenticate to other things. So it's fine to have its own authentication server, but that shouldn't be shared with anything else. So, it's going at the current best practice for each type and layer of device, starting at the infrastructure, moving up to the servers at firmware level, because so many servers have firmware level access irrespective of the operating system. Then
Absolutely. And for those people who don't remember, please review the rootkits episode that we did a while back.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, so I think, these sorts of questions about privilege escalation, the best defense is to start at the bottom and do the grunt work. Find out what your devices are, make sure they're hardened to the right standard, look at your user access profile, how they log on, try and implement two-factor there, try and think about zero trust at that level, at the user level and the third-party level. But unless the infrastructure is properly hardened, and it will always be vulnerable, no matter what clever controls you put in at the user level.
Yeah. And again, as we mentioned before, communicate why you're doing these things, train people in why security exists in the way that it does, and again, train people in the right procedures, let alone your actual policies at a high level, and audit regularly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great stuff. That was very insightful. I think we've kept it to a technical level that's understandable. But again, if anybody has any questions, do feel free to contact us. And that was a great episode, Pete.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Pleasure as always.
No problem. See you next time.
Take care.